Climb DuPont Pioneer. And you?
Good evening. Thank you for thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to have such a wonderful turnout this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dunstan Barnes, and I'm the president of the Intellectual Property Law Society here at Chicago-Kent. We've got about 300 people on our mailing list, so we're probably the largest student society here at the law school. About 100 of those are active members who frequently come to events such as this. And probably for those reasons, we were voted the Student Organization of the Year here at Chicago-Kent last year. It's probably because we put on events like this once a semester, and we usually have smaller events once per week. So yeah, just a few thank yous as well to the IPLS board members. We couldn't have put tonight's event together without all of them. Also to the volunteers who are helping out this evening, and to all of the IPLS members. Now, tonight's event is about food and innovation in food, which might seem like a weird kind of, bringing the law into this might seem kind of strange, but actually there's ancient roots to this. Some of the first patent systems are traced back to Greek and Roman cities, where people who developed new recipes were given exclusive rights to produce that recipe for something like 1 year, which is similar to the patent system we have these days. The timing of tonight's event will be as follows. We have an hour of panel discussion, and then we'll have half an hour where the questions are open so you, the audience, can join in if you have questions. And then after that, we will have the reception will start, and we'll have food and drink. You can finally get some alcoholic drinks in the lobby. The one matter I have to bring up is to see if anyone here objects to us filming tonight's event. Because if you put your hand up, I'm going to have to ask you to leave right now. Great. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Shane Delsman. He is an associate at Fitch, Even, Tabin, and Flannery, and he's one of Illinois' Super Lawyers Rising Star for 2013. He's a thoroughly good bloke, and most importantly, he makes fantastic cocktails. Shane.
Well, I'd also like to thank everybody for coming tonight. I know it's cold out there, but we appreciate you braving the weather to come here. We think we have a pretty amazing event for you tonight. Like Dunstan said, my name is Shane Delsman. I'm here on behalf of the CBA, which I am the IP chair for. With regards to the CBA, those attorneys here who want to get CLE credit, if you didn't sign your name when you came in, if you could do that afterwards, that would help us ensure that you get CLE credit. And also return your survey at the end of the program, please. We should also remember to turn off our cell phones if everybody hasn't turned them off yet or put them on vibrate. I'd also like to thank on behalf of Kent and the Chicago Bar Association, IPLS, who was instrumental in putting this program together, especially Dunstan Barnes, who is the president, and Joe Janis, who was a previous president, who again graciously agreed to help us out this year. So thank you guys. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, and we had numerous sponsors. Core Search, who is outside. They have a table outside. If you didn't get a chance to say hi to them, please do that. The Chicago-Kent Student Bar Association, the Kent Alumni Association, Illinois Sparkling and August Hill Winery, Pastoral, Half Acre, and Freeborn and Peters. So with that, I'll move on to our panel in no particular order. Well, okay, maybe in some order, the way they're sitting up here right now. Thomas and Lori Leavitt, they're the owners and chefs of White Oak Gourmet, a personal chef service featuring organic, locally sourced food, and also Ground Up, a chef-farmer community committed to building local and sustainable farmer-chef connections.
That's us.
Nick Kokonis is next. Nick is a co-owner and managing partner of Alinea and Next Restaurants, as well as the Aviary. It was a good night tonight because they received a couple James Beard nominations tonight. Sure, we can clap for that. Let's be proud of. He's also a returning panelist from last year, the inaugural Symposium, which was well attended as is this year's. Next we have Sendal Devidas. He is a senior intellectual property counsel at Pioneer, and he also has a PhD in plant biology and received his JD from right here in Chicago, although at the John Marshall Law School. So don't hold that against him. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Kevin Bain, who is a James Beard nominated restaurateur. Kevin, along with his partner, Rob Katz, has opened 10 restaurants in Chicago in under 10 years, including Boca, Girl and the Goat, GT Fish and Oyster, and Perennial Verant, to name a few. And it was also a good night for him because he also had some restaurants nominated for James Beard tonight. So that's our panel. It is also my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Professor Buckafusco. Many of you know him as a food-centric law professor here at Chicago Kent, where he began teaching in 2009. Professor Buckafusco also teaches and writes about IP issues in food, including his law review article on whether recipes should be copyrightable. Professor Buckafusco did an amazing job at last year's inaugural Gastro IP Symposium, and we welcome him back this year. If you would please join me in thanking all of the coordinators, sponsors, and panelists with a round of applause while Professor Buckafusco gets set up to start the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. I think, Nick, if we do this next year, we can collect the whole set of whatever they're giving out for the three-peat of these. Thanks, Shane. Thanks, Dunstan. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Certainly, thank you to the Intellectual Property Law Society here at Chicago Kent. In addition to being the best-fed law society, they are also the best-dressed student society here for reasons I'm not entirely sure. But if you're looking for someone to have questions about IP law, look for the guys and the ladies wearing the fine clothes. They're always well-dressed. In any event, on to food, which is much more important. So I want to start the discussion pretty generally, just allowing you each to say a few things, in kind of 3 to 5 minutes about innovation in, with your group. Right. So, how do you think innovation is proceeding? What role does intellectual property play in that innovation, if at all? Where do you see things going well? Where do you see them going poorly? In a few minutes.
I'm going to ask you to start down at the other end.
Okay. So why don't I start with you then, Kevin? Do you mind?
What's that?
Would you mind going first?
I'd love to go first.
Thank you.
Great. Hi, everybody. How are you? Let's see if I remember all the stuff you told me to say. 3 to 5 minutes about myself, I can do it. We Boca Restaurant Group, for those of you who don't know, we are a chef-driven restaurant group. And what does that mean? Every single concept that we have, we base around a chef. And so Paul Verant is our partner at J. Parker, Elaine's Perennial Verant, Stephanie Izard at Girl and the Goat and Little Goat, Giuseppe Tintori at GT and Boca, and Chris Pandell at Bolena. So why is that innovative? Well, it's innovative in the sense that we're not centering our company just around one chef, but we're looking for talent and trying to find people that, we're not finding a concept and then finding someone to fit it. We're finding the talent first and then building our company kind of around it. We use innovation in a number of ways. When we build a concept, if you look at GT Fish, when we start with a concept, we're not looking to kind of repeat what somebody else has done, but we're trying to make something new. So if you look at what we did with GT Fish, we tried to create a concept that was like no other seafood restaurant in America, which was part traditional, part ambitious, part adventurous, and all of that in small plates. What else did you want from me?
That's perfect. That's very nice. Thank you. Sendel?
All right. I'm Sendel Deveres. I'm a senior parent counsel. And before I start, just a couple of disclaimers. My views, comments today are my own and not DuPont Pioneers. And and second disclaimer is I am a lot older than what I look, how I look. So if you, so don't mistake me for an intern from DuPont Pioneer. So anyway, DuPont Pioneer.
I need to know now.
After our wine.
We're not going to discuss age, as I've already decided.
DuPont Pioneer, I don't have to stress anymore. We have IP is what drives the company. More than 200 years back, DuPont started as a gunpowder manufacturing company, transitioned into the plastics, nylons, Teflon, Kevlar, Pioneer seeds. Then DuPont bought Danisco, an industrial bioenzyme manufacturing company, a year and a half ago. So IP is what we live, and without patents and trade secrets and other IP, DuPont Pioneer will not exist. So I think we file hundreds and hundreds of patent applications every year, and patents and trade secrets are what pays us and keeps the company going. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for us, obviously, Alinea was built around the idea that innovation is key to everything we do. We don't try to do a dish or a concept or a technique that other people have done. Of course, we use the techniques and the basis of cooking going back hundreds of years, but then we try to build upon that with Chef Ackett's, a team of 30 chefs. And we always try to do something, quote unquote, innovative. Now, sometimes that's as simple as looking at a series of ingredients in combination that people haven't thought of necessarily before. And sometimes it's pioneering entirely new ways of cooking. But in between that, we always take an open source approach to it. Early on in 2004, we basically decided to put our business plan online. And my general feeling was, good luck copying it. It requires a tremendous amount of labor, and it's very different than a company like DuPont. If anything, being open source for us allows people to share what we do across the internet, allows them to become passionate about what we do, to try it at home and see that it's not impossible, but it's not simple either. And so we've always taken a very open source approach. There have been times where people have crossed essentially what I consider an ethical line, not necessarily a legal one, though that too sometimes probably. And at those times we have tried to enforce our rights, even though we haven't patented something or trademarked it necessarily. But we could talk about that a bit later, but we've had a couple of unique cases like that where we've kind of won with the help of the internet rather than in a court of law. So, and then next in aviary was about trying to reimagine how you can serve and create cocktails, and next was essentially redoing the entire business model of a restaurant and making it new again every 4 months and selling tickets and all of that, which you've probably heard of. So for us it was innovating on both the culinary and professional side of things, which we get offers all the time to do other restaurants. And our first question is, if it isn't new, it isn't innovative, even if we can make a lot of money, we generally have said no. Now, there is a price, of course, at which we'll say yes. So if anybody, I'm not trying to say that, but we haven't reached that point yet. So keep coming with
your offers, is what he's saying.
That's right. That's right.
Put more zeros behind them.
But that aspect is, if we can't learn something about ourselves in the industry, then we don't want to do it no matter what.
Thank you. Thomas?
Good evening, Tom Levitt, White Oak Gourmet. I'm joined by my wife, Lori. We have a personal chef and catering service in northwest suburbs of Chicago. And we help people eat well at home, and when they want to go out to eat, they'll go to Nick or Kevin's restaurants. The way we innovate is we try to provide the best possible product for people who are really interested in eating real food, minimally processed, prepared from scratch food. And as far as what Nick said, freely share recipes. If somebody can produce it better than me, then God bless them.
Amen.
Do you want to say something?
I could speak to the Ground Up Chicago issue. We are a group that's committed to strengthening the bonds between the chef and the farmers, small farmers in particular. Is it innovative that chefs want to have really good, clean food and support small farms? No, it's really kind of an old school idea, but perhaps our approach, along with some other like-minded groups within this region and within the city, perhaps that approach we're finding has not been done yet. So while we're a young group, just about a year old, we're working to become more and more innovative in our approach to from the farmer's aspect, from the chef's aspect, from the restaurateur's aspect. So that's how we're innovative at GroundUpChicago.com.
Thank you. So for those of you who have attended in the past, you will know, and for those of you who think about these issues otherwise, intellectual property law, while it can be useful for people in the position of Sendil is less useful typically for chefs and cooks and cookbook authors. That copyright protection, for the most part, doesn't extend to recipes or dishes. Very few things will meet the demands of patent law. Trademark and trade secret have some application in these areas, but often are limited in their own right. So this is a world in which IP is often kind of running side by side, but not necessarily tightly connected with the kinds of things that you're all doing. So I'm interested in how this is working, right? So Nick made a distinction between the legal and the ethical, right? Between certain kinds of violations that might be truly legal violations and other kinds of behaviors that might only violate some kind of ethical norm. What role does that play? So what's the content of that distinction, and what role does it play? So when would you see situations arising in which you think, someone's doing something inappropriate, even if I'm not going to sue them for it, it's bad? And if that's the case, what can you do about it? Kevin, do you have a thought?
Sure. Nick and I were talking earlier, if Nick and I were in a band and we got up here tonight and we played Brown Eyed Girl, we might not play Brown Eyed Girl, that's kind of a cheesy song, but as long as we attribute it to Van Morrison, I think it's okay, and I think that same way in cooking. I went to my first restaurant, or one of my first restaurants in Springfield a few nights ago. I opened it 17 years ago, and when I walked in, the current owner that I sold it to had been up to a few of my restaurants, and he had the green bean dish from Girl and the Goat on the menu, and he had a dish from GT Fish on the menu, and I took it more as flattery, and he was telling people that it was a dish from our restaurants. It's a little bit different and I've seen this in cases with Nick, where people use actual photographs of food and put it on their website and put it off as their own. That's where it becomes unethical. I'm flattered when somebody tries to take a dish that we've already done and put it on their own menu. I'm certainly fine with it.
So what's the difference so in a world without, right, so law is, at least in theory, supposed to create certain kinds of rules for people to guide their behavior. How does the same thing happen in a world with norms and ethics, right? I mean, you're not, do you talk to your chefs about this? Do you think about it in your own? Where do these norms develop, and how do they get enforced?
Well, there's a time where we, very early on at Alinea, spent about 3.5 months trying to make a certain blown sugar dish, and like many art movements or whatever, you end up with people that have similar ideas that come at them from the same time. And literally, as we sort of figured out how to do this, and the chef team did, and Grant was very excited about it, we were literally just about to put it on the menu. And it was sort of like an orb of creme brulee. It was really beautiful. And we saw someone had done something kind of sort of similar in Spain literally that week. And that was it. We just didn't put it on. Because no one in the world knows that we were doing it independently. So for us, that line was, even though we developed it independently, no one would know that. And everything that we need to do needs to feel original. For us, attribution, like if all of a sudden they put the black truffle explosion at GT Fish and Oyster, which these guys would never do, and Giuseppe would never do.
Tonight, right?
Right. tonight it could be actually really good.
Right? They're serving black truffle explosion.
That would be weird, and kind of everyone would know that. But what's interesting is that sometimes I see people
kill the black truffle.
Right. I see people do similar things where they take a technique or a dish and they change just 1 or 2 ingredients and don't have that attribution. Or in the case of that Wickens guy in Australia who literally made identical copies of some of our dishes in WD-50, put them on his website, and they were literally identical, and said they were his own. Like, he lost his job, he lost his awards, he lost everything. There was no legal reason for that, but he was shamed in the press and on the internet and whatnot. What's interesting to me is that because I live in the world of seeing all these dishes, there's a lot of times where it's a finer line than that, and I see dishes in restaurants where I go, that looks exactly like what Wiley was doing 3 months ago at WD-50, and this guy's doing it in Chicago, and he's not properly attributing that. And I see that with our dishes all the time. To me, that's just a lazy chef or a lazy restaurateur. I'm not happy about it. I'm amazed all the time that the press doesn't kind of notice it, that they review these places and they don't see it. But do I ever pick up the phone and call? No.
And there's a big difference between imitation and inspiration.
That's right.
Inspiration
It's a
is...
finer line, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to the attribution question in just a second. Sendel, I'd kind of like to ask you the inverse of this question, right? So the rest of the panelists kind of operate in a world with relatively little intellectual property and rely on norms to govern behavior. You operate in a world with fairly strong intellectual property protection. But I'm wondering to what extent norms continue to matter. Are there situations in which you think it is appropriate to not pursue legal remedies even though they exist because it would be unethical or unwise for various reasons? Are there situations in which you attempt to enforce things that you don't have intellectual property rights for because you think they're otherwise unwise or unethical?
Right. I mean, if I were your attorney, I would never recommend putting a business plan online, but and
It worked.
I mean, for what Pioneer does, we work with a lot of our farmers, and for the most part, they are ethical, and we are ethical in the sense that if there is an honest mistake on replanting the seeds for the next year, which the farmers are not allowed to do under their agreement that they signed, we don't go and start suing them right away. We engage in a conversation to make sure what happened, even though legally we have every right to go after them. And for example, some of our sales dealers, when they recommend products to our customers, farmers, sometimes we don't have the right product mix. And even though they are Pioneer sales representatives, they offer a competitor product. So I think being ethical in the way that, doing the right thing for our customers, we don't always go with a legal route. But in terms of infringement, patent infringement, once we have to set a clear standard on, we value our IP pretty strongly. And even though if the infringement is a small scale or a large scale, it's still a patent infringement on our IP rights. So we have a policy and tradition to go after enforcement. But Chris, to go to your point, it's not always the case that we go to court to enforce patent infringements. A lot of the times, we work with the customers and get things cleared. And ethically, if that's the right thing to do, that it's not our policy to take our customers to court all the time, but work with them in a way that we protect our IP rights, and our IP rights are respected, and doesn't set a pattern going forward. So ethics play a role more internally and not outward in what we do.
Thank you. So Tom and Lori, both Nick and Kevin mentioned attribution, one of the trends one sees in restaurant menus these days is kind of increased attribution directed towards the farmers rather than towards the chefs, right? I mean, certainly the chefs are getting their own attribution in various ways, James Beard Awards and other things like that. But there certainly is a direction in which the chefs are directing some type of attention towards the farms. What role does that attribution play? Is it important for those relationships? Does it help develop so to the extent that how much do farmers value that attribution, and why do they value it?
Want to take that?
I'll take that. The farmers value it because they take pride in the products they're producing. And then our clients really have a great interest in where their food is coming from. I think in the general world of eating and trying to improve your health, just people want to know where's my food coming from, and having that relationship, even though from my client they may not know the farmer, they know that I have the relationship with the farmer.
And how is it valuable to the farmers, do you think? So, I mean, when you speak to farmers, do farmers say, boy, I think it's great that, they're listing my name on these menus?
Yeah.
It's validation. It's just like if you're cooking and somebody says, wow, that's a great dish, I loved your food, I loved your restaurant. It's validation for what you're doing.
Yeah, it's our experience with our farmers that they like seeing they like getting that exposure, and people don't often know where that piece of pork came from or where those sprouts came from, unless we attribute it.
And they may value that even though there's no direct consumer-to-farm relationship, right?
That I haven't.
So it's not like I'm going to...
Well, and actually, I will take it to that step.
Is that right?
We have clients who have contacted some of the farmers that we have attributed on our menus and created a relationship that way, and bought a side of beef and a hog from Kim Snyder on Faith's Farm in Bonfield.
Great. I once tried to get butter from Diane St. Clair. It didn't go well. Best butter in the world. So the attribution question is an important one, I think, for chefs as well. Many creators seem to care as much or more about attribution than normal intellectual property rights. Somewhat ironically, American intellectual property law doesn't recognize a right to attribution. But I'm wondering if there are situations in which attribution can backfire. Right, so you mentioned this situation, Kevin, where the chef down in Springfield is preparing your dishes and saying, as done at
Yes.
wherever, right?
Was there attribution?
And Nick, in a conversation earlier, mentioned a restaurant in London which was interested in putting together a kind of greatest hits of contemporary cooking menu, where they would have a couple dishes from this place and a couple dishes from this place, but prepared presumably by their own chefs.
Yeah.
Do you get worried that there are situations in which the attribution is doing you a disservice?
Just like butchering a cover song? Yeah.
Precisely. Like, in the same way that we would all think worse about Brown-Eyed Girl if we heard you perform it.
Can I do it? Yeah, it would be. We would butcher it.
Speak for yourself. I feel
Really?
pretty
Can you
good
do it?
about it. We can do it.
Let's just say that the restaurant's interpretation in Springfield was okay. It wasn't spectacular. Yeah, it's. I guess it's a worry. But
We turned the deal down. It was a very lucrative deal. They were going to pay us $4 for every dish they produced and have 10 of the best chefs in the world, Mugaritz, LBE, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was $8 for every customer that went through their restaurant, 200 a night, $1,600 a day. We would never even have to go there, basically. We just have to give them the right to produce it. And we turned it down.
Mm-hmm.
Because I figured, A, there was no way they could possibly make money and pay out that much money to the chefs. So they would never last, even though they were really well financed. And then B, they would cut corners, and that people would think that that's us. Mm-hmm. And so I guess from a monetary standpoint, it's a stupid decision. But at the same time, your brand and everything that we're doing moving forward relies on that. And there's a core integrity issue too. Like, part of what we do is to make money, but part of what we do is to make people, we try to give people great pleasure. Mm-hmm. It's fun and delicious. Mm-hmm. So part of what we're doing is not about the monetary. The money is a wonderful side aspect of doing something really well. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that's true of absolutely anything, actually. But having said that, yeah, we worry about that all the time. And that's why we don't do a lot of things. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, even with my restaurant in Springfield, I have not owned it for 16 years. And there are still people that walk up to me every once in a while and say, hey, I had your dinner at your restaurant in Springfield the other night. I really had a bad meal. And I'm like, I haven't owned it since 1997, just to let you know. So, yeah, it's a worry.
Mm-hmm. Is it also, so there's much talk about attribution. When one thinks about attribution in, the experiences that I've seen when it's taken place and when it's gone well, or even if it's gone poorly, it tends to be kind of restaurants at very different levels. Right, so it's the place in Springfield doing this dish, or it's for example, Nick, there are many of these blogs that are the home cook is doing the Alinea book at home.
I love those guys.
Yeah, so I get that you love those guys, right? I'm wondering why. So, are there examples of this kind of attribution taking place at the elite level, like between elites, right? So I see it and I see the value of it between elites and non-elites. But when's it happening between elites?
I mean, it happens all the time. Like, we did the restaurant swap with Love and Madison Park, where we opened up inside of Love and Madison Park in a collaborative way, and they opened up in Chicago. Now, we did our own food in both places, but we used their entire staff, and they used our entire staff to produce the recipes there, and vice versa. That would be the ultimate full, we called it our wife swap. Like, it was like the ultimate full restaurant swap, and it was an insane, difficult, creative, fun thing to do. But it happens all the time where we'll collaborate on a smaller scale to do dinners all over the world and just do a dish or two. And sometimes there's actually a wonderful example of it in Austria. that the Red Bull guy built, where they literally bring in a chef for a week to train their staff. And Grant spent a week there and trained their staff, and they did that menu for a season. And we felt strongly that they were able to actually pull that off. And then and they donate the vast majority of money to charity. So there are times where it's done the right way, where it's a wonderful thing. And there's also, like, how many times have you been in a restaurant and sometimes, or we did the escoffier. We ripped off escoffier completely for our first menu at Next, but literally put the number of every single recipe. So there's a right way to do it.
You presumably would not have done that if per se, though, right?
You know, no, but, you know, have we ever done something in the style of Thomas Keller and attributed it? Yes.
Great. So I want to think about, you know, we're kind of fortunate here that we have a panel that spans, you know, creative culinary production. And I'm interested in the interactions kind of, I mean, you know, I was thinking it originally as a top-down, but it's much more cyclical than that, between chefs and farmers, between farmers and the industrial production companies, the scientific companies like DuPont Pioneer. So I'd be interested in your reflections on what I imagine is some kind of, you know, bi-directional relationship, right? So let me say what I think I mean by that. And you can tell me if I don't mean anything and I'm not making any sense. But I guess what I'm wondering is, to what extent are chefs and farmers influenced by the kinds of things that are going on at DuPont Pioneer and other places like that, and vice versa, right? So to what extent is DuPont Pioneer and other you know, other food science labs influenced by what happens at the ground level? And part of what I'm interested in is kind of supply and demand effects, right? What role do chefs play in creating demand for certain kinds of products? What role does DuPont Pioneer play in creating availability for certain kinds of products? Does this make sense?
I think.
Okay. Would you like to give it a shot?
I'll give it a shot. Well, at Ground Up, what we try to do is, through access, education, and support, connect the chef and the farmer and the farmer and the chef. And we support those chefs, like Chris Pandel, for example, who support the small farmers, who ask the small farmers to grow certain things for them if they can. And this was a question we perhaps had earlier. The chef will never tell the farmer how to grow the food, and the farmer would never tell the chef how to cook the food. But through supporting this way, we support the small farmers, the young farmers, and let them know that there's a niche here and you can sell to this market. We try to provide access to them. And then we support those chefs who walk the walk.
So these are niche farmers, which really may not be the market that Pioneer
Small farmers, yeah.
Serves.
Yeah.
Good. Sindel, so
Yeah, sure. I think you alluded, Tom. Yeah, Pioneer does not sell like vegetable seeds or fruit seeds, but no, we are looking into that area. But most of our customers are larger farmers who buy corn, soybean, canola seeds. But at least I can give an example on corn-fed beef, customers from China, and grass-fed beef. China wanted to import beef from the U.S. and they wanted grass-fed beef, but one of our farmers who also raises cattle could not supply the grass-fed beef, so he substituted with corn-fed beef. And then the year later or next year, they came back and said, whatever beef you gave, we want that. The corn-fed beef, of course, tastes better. I think there's no direct connection in terms of what we sell and whatever end customers want in terms of food and restaurants, but in terms of our customers' need, it's a little more on a higher level on drought tolerance and yield. So not specific to address your questions, but I think our larger customers go with the trend on what their end users want. So unless we start eating more corn and soybeans, I'm not sure I can add more value.
So you know, to what extent are you responsive to? I mean, so the grass-fed beef is something of a trend, right? This is a trend driven in part by foodies and restaurants and others who care about that. Does that trickle up to you or down, I suppose?
It does bubble up, but
Bubble up, thank you. Much better metaphor.
I think we have different levels of tech, too. So
Right?
our cooking is low-tech, theirs is high-tech, his production is high-tech.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So
And the farmers we deal with are low-tech production methods as well.
Well, but what's interesting, I think, is that people probably think of Alinea as being a very high-tech place, but we support 7 or 8 family farms where we buy everything they produce, and we actually do tell them how to make it and how to
Alright.
produce it. For our current menu...
I would not do that, just for the record. You can do that, of
Well,
course.
you know, for our current menu, for the hunt, we have a wonderful dish that's a carrot dish where we basically wanted them to keep the carrots in the ground until the first frost. And back in the 19th century, when the frost would happen, they would harvest it all at once and then put it into sawdust to preserve it as a desiccant. And so we wanted to do that. And so months ahead, we told the farmers, don't pick any of your carrots. We'll buy them all, even if they go bad. Leave them in the ground, let the frost happen, and we're going to do this because we think it'll produce a very unique, authentic dish. We took the risk ahead by guaranteeing these small farmers that we were going to, no matter what happened to your product,
Purchase
we're
it
still going to
production.
pay you, right? And it ended up being a really wonderful thing. And so we work with a lot of people, and I think the important thing that you said earlier was that local, sustainable, and organic is that fight has been won at any ambitious restaurant in America. Alice Waters won that battle a
Yeah.
long time ago. We live in the Midwest. If you want carrots in the Midwest, you're either getting them preserved or you're getting them flown in. And for this menu, we chose to try to preserve them in a very old way, which was interesting and cool, but probably not something a normal restaurant could afford to do. Nonetheless, supporting those small farmers who are going to produce superior product is incredibly important. I know it's equally important to Kevin's restaurants. Anybody who's producing an ambitious restaurant in a major urban area now, your small farmers are people that you need to know, that you need to trust and support, and vice versa. It's just a given.
So Kevin, do you think of yourself as a tastemaker, a norm entrepreneur here, where you're trying to, part of what you're doing in promoting chefs and in promoting your chefs and promoting these farms and this kind of way of eating and cooking is telling the people who are coming to your restaurants this is in some ways the right way to eat?
Yeah, sort of. Back one point
Sure.
to this real quick. We've been developing, myself and Rob and Stephanie, a kind of fast food chicken restaurant that we wanted to do. And this was based on serving the beautiful chicken from Swan Creek at Girl and the Goat, which we basically, Walter made enough chicken to just for Girl and the Goat. He couldn't make any more. That was it. And so our big issue has been finding enough farms, and enough room in the processing plants, which there's only like one processing plant around, to be able to do it. So we figured out the only way that we were going to be able to do it was to not only open up a fast food chicken restaurant, but at the same time open up a processing plant. So that's a lot of responsibility. We're trying to figure out if we can actually pull that off. So yeah, supply is a big part of it. You look at all these other fast food chicken restaurants, they're not exactly buying chicken from the most ethical of places. So it's tough.
Are you also trying to create the demand, though, by serving food in this way, by highlighting farms and chefs?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, yes, we are. When we open up a restaurant, we're basically saying we think that the public is going to buy this. This is the way that you should eat. We're going to market it that way, and we think that they'll come.
So maybe I can challenge you a little bit on these points, right? Should we be concerned then that the people who are the tastemakers in food and responsible for the way things are going tend also to have somewhat elite status, and tend to be concerned about less concerned about whether I will eat and more concerned about how well I will eat. Right? So some of the kinds of issues that come up with respect to GMO foods and other kinds of foods like that are cost issues and availability issues. So do you worry, and should you worry, about these types of issues? Like, if I'm pushing anti-GMO or local and organic, is that harming people who don't have the money to eat non-GMO or non-local and non-organic?
It's a heavy question. Who wants to take it?
I think that there are two different.
You guys were agreeing very much,
here-
so I'm going to try and mix it up a little.
I think there are two different questions.
Yeah.
Nobody needs to eat in any of my restaurants, period. We're entertainment. to be honest. I mean, like, and I mean that not in a bad way, but entertainment like going to an art museum or something like that. You don't go to Alinea for sustenance, you go for something else. I am glad that DuPont has made all these amazing seeds that can produce an insane amount of food for 7 billion people. I just don't want to serve any of it in my restaurant. They're two completely different things. So that doesn't mean that necessarily that what they're doing is unethical, wrong, all those sorts of things. It means that we're trying to go to the highest plane we can go to for 86 people a night. And it's an incredibly culturally sensitive issue. It's something that we all have to do. We all have to eat 3 times a day. And so people get very passionate about it because we all have to do it. And so I've had people come at me and say what you do is ethically wrong because you're charging $300 for a meal. And it'll be the same person who will pay $300 to go see Madonna play, which I think is a travesty. So, you know, it's art.
Preferences differ.
Right. You know, I mean, it's
we
art
don't judge
and
here.
that's science, and they're two different things. So we're trying to aim for like the highest ideal, but it doesn't mean that that's everything or even important, really.
Yeah.
I hope that we change the way people look at food a little bit, and I hope that that trickles down to restaurants that everybody can get, and they approach things a little bit better. But I also don't begrudge, you know, the millions and millions and millions of people who just need cheap calories, which is different.
Tom and Laura?
Yeah, I don't think we're judging or passing judgment on anybody that feels that maybe it's out of reach, that kind of food is out of reach. It's what we do. I think it's what up here, what we all do.
How you spend your money, it's a personal choice.
You know,
and what you eat,
yeah.
and the choices you make. You may want to eat organic because you have a set of beliefs that tell you that's right for yourself, and other people are going to say, well, organic's a bunch of hooey.
And, you know, that's okay. They can say that.
We opened up, Little Goat Diner for that very reason, that we wanted to do a restaurant where we did the same practices that we did everywhere else, that we were ambitious about getting local, organic, sustainable food. We were prepping it in the same exact way, and you were still able to go in there and get an $8 sandwich or a $10 sandwich or a $10 omelet. That's why we did it. So I have restaurants that kind of fall all over the check average line. And Nick's right. Nick does a very specific restaurant, and there's a need for his restaurant in the market. He doesn't need to apologize for it. That's what he does.
Certainly. Sendel, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against organics. I'm not against people who want to choose what they want to eat. But DuPont Pioneer's goal is more global, to feed the global hunger. And a lot of economists and scientists have clearly come out and said, like, if the whole agriculture has to shift to organics, there's no way we can feed a growing population, which is going to double by, or at least go to 12 billion by 2050. And when the arable acres are going down and the demand is going up, if someone wants to choose what they want to eat and if they have the monetary wherewithal to do that, all good for them. But there are a lot of, like Nick alluded to, a lot of millions of people who just need a meal a day to survive. And DuPont cares more, DuPont cares about them. And naturally, we see more market opportunities for emerging markets and where the next population growth is going to happen. But what we want is, we're not against organics, but not against, not like having the organics call a GMO, anti-GMO. So I think people need to know what's out there in the market. And for example, just to give one example of what the organic so-called pesticide use is, organic farmers have used Bt toxins or bacillus bacterial toxins a number of years on spraying. But when you take the gene, what kills the bugs, and put it in a plant and express it, it becomes a GMO and they don't want it. So I think the facts need to be considered and the evidence should be fully considered by the people. And I think that's what DuPont Pioneer stands for. Have the right evidence, the scientific basis, and then make your own call.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
Didn't some of the insects develop a resistance, though, to the Bt corn, and therefore, by developing the resistance, the organic farmers can't use that Bt spray, which is considered organic. So it seems like a two-edged sword on the GMO product. It's not really contaminating, but it affects the
Right.
organic
Yeah,
properties.
the resistance has occurred, which when the insects develop resistance to a particular toxin, and the EPA and the crop industries have worked to come up with a resistance management program. I think it has to be followed by the farmers, and we have a lot of education outreach activities to tell the farmers how to minimize the resistance activities. And part of the maintenance is to have a non-GM or a non-biotech crop as a buffer to keep the resistance from becoming more prevalent. So yes, there is a concern, and the industry has addressed that in a more meaningful way.
Right, so I wanted to turn back now to questions of IP and kitchens. And so as we've talked about, intellectual property law doesn't often do much for the kinds of things that chefs do, right? At least one of the things that chefs do, which is create new dishes and cook them, right? So in that respect, intellectual property law is not helping very much for what they do. And I'm wondering if the lack of IP there will end up affecting the ways in which chefs compete and restaurants compete and cooks compete with one another, right? So let me, think about an analogy. Now in the world of, music piracy, musicians tend to make relatively little money on the music that they create. And instead they tend to compete on shows, right? It's the performance where they make their money now. So instead of the content of the music, it's the performance where they're able to bring in lots of money and earn a living, right? And I guess I'm wondering if we should be concerned that the same thing might happen in food. Nick, last time, I think we both shared the opinion that, IP protection for food might be, at least the kinds of things that chefs do, would probably be a bad thing. But now I guess I want to push you on that and say, well, maybe if they had IP protection, would we have them compete more on the food that they cook rather than on performance, right? So what we end up seeing now, one could argue, is competition on, concepts and performance and personality. And maybe those aren't the kinds of things we in fact want to be competing on. What we really want is the best tasting food. Kevin?
You start getting IP protection on recipes, it's going to be brutal.
Yeah.
If I have to call my attorneys every time a chef changes a menu, I'm done. I quit.
There are a lot of attorneys out here who really like that work, though. They'd be thrilled to do that job.
I put it up for sale. That's we talked about this earlier. I mean, maybe is there a way that you could kind of do it like ASCAP did it, to where there was, you are the songwriter of this dish, and there's some sort of culinary ASCAP license that you have, and someone else can do it, but they have to attribute it to it, and every time you sell it, you pay 3 cents. Every time you sell the truffle explosion, I sold 17. Here's your check for 51 cents, Nick Kokonis. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't like it. I think it. I don't like it.
I think your premise is flawed.
Go ahead.
And the premise is flawed because the experience, you can go home and cook a black truffle explosion. I can teach you how to do it. I've made it. It's possible. It tastes really, really good, even though you made it at home. But what you didn't get is everything else all around it. And I gave a talk not so long ago at a TEDx called Designing Experience. And what you can't believe, perhaps, is that the food is a necessary but not sufficient condition to having a great restaurant. And we have great food and great chefs at our restaurants, but we also train our staff constantly. Every day at 4 o'clock, there's a meeting, and we know exactly who's walking in the door and what their preferences are. And it's all about the entire dining experience. That's part of what you're paying for. It's a huge part of what you're paying for, beyond the food. So as I always say, that information's out there. I'll give you any recipe you want, and you can go home and cook it and spend the 8 hours it takes to make one of those little bites, and it will be a relatively unfulfilling experience for you. You could try to build a restaurant that has all those other things going along with it, but you're going to have to work really hard and get up really early in the morning to do it and to compete with us. So we've always taken an open source approach to it. We've always said, here's how we do everything. And I think in the long run, it creates a very collaborative environment with other restaurants, with other chefs around the world who come in and share what they learned with us, and we're all better off for it.
Tom?
Plus, menus change, dishes change, what we want to create changes. So what's floating your boat right now isn't going to do it 6 months down the road, and why put a protection on it?
Okay, so is it possible, though, that things may be moving too fast? Right? So, the amount of time and effort that you spend inventing new dishes, that costs, that's a lot of time and effort, right? Those are serious costs. Should we be worried that things, like, you say you don't cook the same dish twice, Nick, right? And, certainly lots of these restaurants are like that. Might we want that? Right? Might it be okay if there were situations in which, you could go in and get the same thing every time and, know that this is the place that makes it best and makes it only?
The bolognese at Riccardo Trattoria is awesome. I go there all the time and order it, and they're making bank on me and my family.
And you would do the same with me at the Paris 1906 menu, but you won't give it to me anymore.
And that's my business strategy.
Makes me unhappy.
I think, Chris, it goes towards the market-driven cost-benefit analysis. Like what Kevin said, it doesn't make sense to call your attorney every time when you see a product being copied or used. And also going back to the music analogy, I think they are getting more money from the performance because I think the music industry model has changed since the iTunes came out. So instead of buying the CD, which pay for the whole CD, then picking and choosing the songs. So few artists make more by the sales than I think more try to make by going for the performance. I think the analogy to the music industry may not be directly applicable to what Kevin and Nick are saying. So I think if the stakes are high, you will find a way to enforce it.
Kevin, thoughts on this?
Listen, I just at the end of the day, I think that it would be very easy if everyone was having to look very closely at their recipe. There would be a way to tweak it just slightly different to where there wasn't going to be a legal approach to it. I think it would just get ugly. So I don't think there's any way to make it happen.
So this is taking place, before we turn over to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask one last question. This is, our discussion here is taking place in an academic setting. But for the most part, these kinds of food and innovation issues aren't studied in these settings very often. The kinds of relationships that we have tonight are pretty rare between people from different aspects of the food community, as well as academics and practitioners and others. Is there a world for this kind of stuff? Would you like to see opportunities for interactions between farmers and chefs and restaurants and science in something like, think tanks? Or the MIT Media Lab. I don't know if you're familiar with the Media Lab. Would it be, should there be academic interest and scholarly interest in these kinds of issues as well?
I mean, I can name a whole bunch of cases where there already is.
Yeah.
Nathan Myhrvold put out an amazing book, right? He's not a chef. And I would argue that that's the most important cookbook that's been put out in the last 10 years, maybe more. And it's very scientific. It's completely different than what a chef would put out, and very important and wonderful. And he's shared all of that with all the chefs and vice versa. I just talked to a company called Ag Local that is trying to put together small farms and create an online marketplace for small farms directly to restaurants. And they've done it in San Francisco and the East Coast. That is the kind of thing which it's software. It is very much an IP issue. The ticketing system that I developed, I view completely differently than I do a recipe.
Yeah.
It's a business practice, and it's software, and I have great use for attorneys like yourself in that regard. So it's just two different things, but they're aspects of the same coin.
Right.
And I'm sure that if I opened up something that looked just like GT Fish and Oyster, regardless of down the street, regardless of the name or whatever, I bet I'd get a phone call. You know?
It'd just be a good old-fashioned brawl. There'd be no attorneys involved.
But we did, like, we've had Carnival Cruise Lines copied our menu design, and technically we didn't really have a trademark on it, but they didn't really know that. And so my general strategy is to send them a cease and desist and have them ship it all to us, which they did. Because ultimately, even though we didn't have the IP, they could have figured that out, but they didn't.
How did you figure it out?
Oh, people send us, anytime anything's infringed upon, the internet polices it.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful and amazing thing. And we got an email one day that said, you know, check out the Carnival Cruise Lines Chef's Tasting Menu. And it was exactly a copy physically of our menu design. And the same thing happened with our website, which got copied by a sushi restaurant in Austin. In that case, the design firm literally just copied it and didn't even tell the restaurant owner about it. So that guy was generally clueless and pretty appalled when it happened. So there's been a number of cases like that, and even though we didn't really have our intellectual property in place, we either faked it or sort of said, well, we have 150,000 people following us on social media, and you're going to lose.
It's certainly one of these interesting situations in which, you know, the internet is being used to detect piracy, not to create it.
Yeah.
Right.
I got an interesting email a couple of weeks ago. There is a brand new coffee shop. I think they opened 3 of them in Wisconsin, and it's called Mocha, M-O-K-A. And their logo is my exact logo with an M at the front of it. You could literally lay it on top of it. So yeah, that was interesting. My cease and desist letter will
So
be out
why? What's the
next week.
intuition behind that then? Why send that cease and desist letter? And, you know, Nick, why yours? And not, you know, when they're, you know, remaking, you know, the dishes.
Well, to be honest, at first I just saw it and I'm like, well, this is cute. But when I saw that they had 3 of them, I was like, I don't like this. And I'd heard it a couple times already. I mean, go get your own logo. I just think it's kind of cheap. I spent a lot of money on that logo. That cost me $3,000. Pay me. Yeah, that's it.
So what's the intuition, Nick, between why you know, stealing the menu design is a problem, whereas,
well,
you know...
it's the Carnival Cruise Lines, for Christ's sake. We saw what just happened with them. So, I don't want anyone to think that we're remotely involved with Carnival Cruise Lines.
So if Carnival Cruise Lines was knocking off Truffle Explosion?
No, they weren't doing the menu.
But if they were, would they get a letter for that?
I think they were.
Oh, no, and if they did that, I mean, for sure, they'd hear from us. But, you know, they'd hear from us in a way that wouldn't necessarily be a letter from the lawyers. It would be posted on the internet. And that has wondrous and amazing effects if you do it in the right way.
Mm-hmm. You think I should shame them?
It's different, you know?
You think I should shame them instead of talking to my lawyer?
That's exactly what I would have done. If I were your PR person, that's exactly what I would have done.
Come to my Facebook tonight.
I'll share.
There might be shaming going on.
Nice. Good. So I think we'll take some questions from the audience. Shane has a microphone to pass around, so if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand high. Shane will walk with you.
Phil Donahue with Shane Delsman.
And just trying to remind everybody to please speak in the mic so we can get it on tape. Thank you. So I guess I have a question for Nick and Kevin, along the lines of what we were all just discussing. Like, why would you care if someone was ripping off a dish if, like you said, the internet, people are going to know it's a ripoff, and, your restaurants are primarily chef-driven, and, I mean, it's bound to be created by, an inferior chef. So I guess what's the big deal?
Just to be clear, I don't care. Take a picture of one of our dishes, put it on the internet, copy something, whatever. I'd bring it on. I could care less. It's all good marketing for my restaurants. It's just I don't want somebody taking something and exactly maybe in this town and trying to pull it off as their own. If somebody on our little corridor of Randolph is doing the same exact dish that we're doing at Girl and the Goat 2 doors down, there's probably going to be an issue. But no, if somebody's trying to pull off the same dish at some other restaurant somewhere in the United States, God love them.
I mean, I think for us it depends on what you're doing, We have certain things that we spend literally years trying to develop that is called a dish or whatever, but there's a lot going on there. And to me, it's just a bit offensive to then see it elsewhere without saying, hey,
Attribution.
Yeah, we figured this out through you guys and your efforts and whatnot, because at least you're getting, instead of it being it's a little sneaky at times. What really bothers me is that I can give you an example. I'll give you a concrete example. There's a dish at a restaurant that's no longer open in Chicago that kept every technique, but replaced every ingredient. But visually, it was identical. No food writer noticed it, not one. And the first time I went there and ate it, I was kind of dumbstruck. I was kind of going like, that you can't do that unwillfully. It's not accidental. It was like someone lazy got up in the morning and went, well, instead of the chocolate, I'll use the pea, and instead of this, I'll use that. And you go, really? Wow, that's kind of just, it doesn't really hurt me. I agree. It's just offensive. And it doesn't hurt me at all because I didn't even come up with it. I'm talking about, for our chefs and Grant and all that. Like, it's just, you look at it and you just kind of go, man, I thought better of you. I mean, it's different than if you're making, we could open up a restaurant and do a lobster roll, and it's not going to be his lobster roll. We're going to make it our own. But there's sort of like iconic dishes like a lobster roll or bolognese or whatever it is. But if someone starts doing a candy apple helium scented balloon in their restaurant, that would be kind of weird.
I make that all the time.
Yeah, I thought that was a Carême dish. No? Yep, a question over here.
Hi, my question kind of piggybacks on that comment a little bit. At what point will creme brulee balls become in the public domain or iconic? At what point would you not necessarily not serve it in your restaurant because it's not innovative, but for the whole panel, when does a dish or a recipe become in the public domain or iconic, as you said?
Once it hits Des Moines, Iowa?
Des Moines.
That is an awesome answer. I was going to say Cleveland.
Yeah, once,
that's okay, right?
Once it's on the menu at TGI Fridays. I mean, all these things eventually permeate the mid markets, and nothing against TGI Fridays or Des Moines,
The
Iowa.
liquid chocolate centered cake is the classic example of that.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
So initially a Jean-Georges Von Gerichten dish.
that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, and now every menu everywhere in the world.
Every menu in the world has it. Except for Jean Jordan's, probably.
They didn't have it at lunch.
It goes back to that great part in Devil Wears Prada where Meryl Streep is telling her about her cerulean blue sweater, and do you think you made that decision? That decision was made for you. She got it at Nicole Miller. Where'd she get it? I don't know.
I didn't see it, so. Devil Wears Prada, really? You went right to Devil Wears Prada.
It's a good movie. Solid movie, 8.5.
My question is mostly for Lori and Thomas, but if anyone has an opinion, I'd like to hear it. I was wondering how legitimate you think the U.S. organic labeling is for whether or not something is actually organic.
I'll take that. The organic labeling is just a set of standards that is governed by the United States government so that the farmer or the producer can have that label. And there's certain layers of organic. Some can be 95% organic and still contain that label. And there's a lot of farmers that we deal with that don't go through the steps to get certified, but they might be beyond organic as far as the standards go, but they don't pay the fee to get it their farm certified. But they believe in what they're doing and go beyond that.
Tom, it's a bit of a travesty, though, isn't it? They have to pay all that money and fill out all those forms, but to be a GMO, they don't have to.
Right.
Anybody can get it, yeah.
And we're talking about small farmers here. I mean, to pay the fees, $800 fee for certain things, it's just not feasible.
And the paperwork, too. I mean,
Yeah.
they don't have time for that.
And they're working sun up to sundown. So, like Tom said, I would say to the farmer that we work with, they work in something called beyond organic. And how do you know that? Well, we visit them. We've visited every farm that we use, as well as I'm sure the chefs at your restaurants do. And you spend time on their farm and you work on their farm, and there's a whole discussion we can have about that.
So again,
about chef camp and stuff like that.
And it seems like there are ways in which attribution and brands matter, right? You have they trust you, they trust, that this comes from you, and then they know without anything else that it's important.
Well, you're going to see companies like Ag Local that I talked about, where instead of relying on the government certification, there's going to be a private company that goes and does it for the farmer, essentially. So they don't have to fill out forms. They will send someone there. They will literally document, take pictures, go every 4 months, and certify it on their own.
But for the consumer as a whole, the organic label does give them a sense of security that their product that they're purchasing is somewhat pure.
In the grocery stores, you know, that's what, if you're shopping grocery stores, look for the word organic.
Another question?
Does this work? Yeah.
Sounds good.
I don't know if you guys have had the chance to deal with yet, or if so, what you would do. You talk about the flattery or the attribution that you get as long as you're given credit for it. But have you had a situation where someone in your employment has left, taken those ideas with them, and tried to replicate that in another location? In Sandil's environment, obviously, there's a lot that, and non-disclosures and IP that protects that. But for Nick and Kevin, how would you guys see that in your field?
I think Nick just talked about it, how someone had just lightly veiled a dish and slightly replaced a couple of ingredients. I can't think of any specific examples with me, but if a sous chef at one of our restaurants had left and gone to another restaurant and opened his own and kind of taken something that we had done at one of the restaurants, especially if it was in the proximity of our restaurants or here in Chicago, I don't think I would do anything legally, but I certainly would have a conversation with him. I just would say, really? I don't know if that many self-respecting chefs would do that, though, especially if they were going and establishing themselves and doing an opening menu and then taking something and blatantly ripping it off. I don't think they would do it just because they know that they would be subject to the scorn and contempt of their former mentor and their former bosses.
Developing their own style is a process that happens over a great long period of time. So we've had a great many chefs that have gone on and built their own restaurants, many of which are awesome, and I love going there, and they've developed their own style over time. And so you see hints of technique and style there, just like Grant's Food is Thomas Keller.
You're taking a skill set with you from each place that you go. You're not taking particular dishes.
Yeah, I look at that as part of our what's the right word? Part of what we're required to do is to teach these people to go out and start their own restaurants and do their own thing. We can only create so much opportunity for ambitious people. So I'm helping 2 of our former chefs right now build restaurants where I'm not going to be an owner and have any stake in it whatsoever, but I'm giving them the spreadsheets and the knowledge they need to go build their own restaurants because I feel like they've developed as amazing chefs and people. So I think that's a wonderful thing, but like Kevin said, if someone just opened up down the street and did the same thing, and I've seen people rip off our concept, like the next concept is starting to get ripped off. I don't call it a rip-off, though. It's like, of course, someone else is going to do that. It makes sense that they would.
Great. Other questions? There it is.
So you talk a little bit about the role that the internet can help in filling in the gaps where there may not be IP protection or protecting goodwill, which relates to trademark, but the internet is kind of a fickle beast. So does that mean that you're necessarily also paying attention to things, like negative things that may go against your establishments on the internet, say like bad reviews or concerns about certain types of patents or Twitter accounts if you're Burger King, that sort of thing? Do you pay attention to that?
Pay attention to all of it. Look at all of it. It's the online reviews, absolutely. Major analytics that we use inside our corporate office every single day. I search on every single morning. I search Twitter for every single restaurant name. We look at the open table reviews every single morning. Every 7 days, we print every single restaurant out. And at management meeting, I bring what our Yelp scores were for that week, what percentage of those were 4 or 5 star, how that matches up against our total aggregate score, and what our open table restaurant scores are against each other. We look at everything. It's really, really important. And we actually respond to every single Yelp review, positive and negative. We just did the negative for a long, long time, and I'm like, well, what? We should also be responding to the people who liked it. So, yeah, look at everything.
Yeah, Google alerts.
Yep.
I understand to a large extent, especially Nick and Kevin operate in a fairly closed community with a lot of norms. To any extent, do you use any IP issues, such as non-disclosures, explicitly treating your recipes as trade secrets, limiting the access, or do you totally ignore that side?
I used to be a derivatives trader, and we would create models that would make a lot of money, and I would have people sign NDAs, and a year and a half later, inevitably, your market went from 12 cents wide to 8 cents wide because they moved from your firm to Susquehanna, and then you had to prove that they did it. And I learned long ago that NDAs are very narrowly enforceable, and what's better is to engender a sense of loyalty, trust, and import to what you're doing. We give our stagiaire who come in for a day the full recipe to what we're doing. And by doing so, we trust them to not steal it. They have, sure, but I think it's unenforceable.
Is there anything explicit so that people would know that, or is it something that they're supposed to know in the industry?
If you spent 15 minutes in the Alinea kitchen, you'd be scared to death to do anything wrong. And I mean that, like, obviously I'm joking a little bit, so I'll answer your question more directly. I don't think it's enforceable. And so anything that I don't think is enforceable, I just don't worry about. I do think things like our design patents are enforceable for serviceware and things like that.
Yeah, the question I have is what's the basis for assuming then that the employees know what they're supposed to be doing and that's consistent with your beliefs?
Oh, I mean, it's both implicit and explicit that within the industry there is a norm at that level of the industry that if you come into a kitchen like that, you're there to learn, and you can certainly take techniques back, but you wouldn't take a dish back. And is it explicit? Boy, it's really hard to say, but it's a very traditional, I'd call it almost antiquated environment.
Good question back here.
Yeah, this is kind of a global one, so I'm not sure who would best address it. But there are places, Nick, like yours and some others in Chicago with molecular gastronomy, those types of small bites meals, where a person like myself can walk out feeling quite satiated because of the depth of the experience, not because of the amount of calories necessarily that were on the plate. But I've also done reading that indicates that with the organic products, with certain ways that meat is processed or grown, that you have an amazingly different content of omega-3 fatty acids and protein even in the same per ounce serving. So I'm wondering if, going back to this having to feed 7 billion people on the planet, are there ways that we can use things that are more nutrition dense, whether we're as creative and beautiful as the restaurants that you gentlemen have made, that we don't have to choose between quality and quantity?
That's you.
I think from what I want to say is biotech crops are not going to be the only solution to feed the 7 billion people. So local sustenance farming and local sustainable agriculture practices are going to be essential. But in terms of the difference in the nutrition and biotech versus organics, I think it's better, you can check the facts. There are numerous studies that said there's no real nutritious benefit into organics versus biotech foods. But in terms of how it is grown, a small farmer may put more care and do things differently, so that particular portion may have a different nutritious value. But on an average, the evidence has shown that there's no clear difference between the nutritious benefit of organic food versus biotech foods. But the global feeding the global population, feeding to reduce the hunger is going to be a holistic approach. It's not just going to be biotech, not just going to be small local developments in the farming. It's going to be a whole package. And I think biotech crops are going to be an integral part of that. But I'm not sure if I answered your question, but in terms of how do you transfer nutrition value, I can tell at least a couple of projects that Pioneer is doing on increasing the protein content of soybeans and increasing the oil content of soybeans and corn can give rise to more nutritious end product. So it can be done, but it needs a holistic approach.
That's refreshing to hear that from a seed company like you, because some seed companies or GMO proponents would say that our way is the only way that we're going to have to feed the billions in the world.
Just want to repeat my disclaimer. It's my view.
That's fine.
Very good. In the back, yes, thank you.
You talked about feeding a lot of people, and I'm wondering how in the long term that we can't destroy the very resources that we'll need in order to feed those many people in the future. And I grew up on a farm. We had we raised corn, soybeans, and even back 15 years where GMOs were thought of as this great thing that was going to create amazing abundance with less labor, and we found that there's super weeds that are occurring, super bugs occurring, and so it's turning abundance into scarcity and destroying the very resources that we'll need to feed people in the future. And so I'm wondering what are the liability issues if there is a certain thing where it comes out, creates, takes away the amenities for producing a large amount of food that's compromised because of whether it's genetically engineered plants or microbes.
I assume it's for me, right? I think I just want to repeat the notion that it's the whole farming practice has to be managed in a sustainable way. Overuse of certain types of technologies are going to create some problems, and I think your point is well taken. It's going to take a more balanced approach on how we do things. Going back to tillage and using buffer zones and how do we rotate crops. It's all part of the package on how we make this agriculture more sustainable for generations to come. So there's no one silver bullet. It's going to be part of a holistic approach. So,
from my perspective is, and I'm not a farmer, but I deal with them, but you have to feed the soil as well to grow the plants. And a lot of the inputs are very detrimental to the soil and to the environment as well. Hence, going back to the other question about if the soil is poorly managed, then the food coming out will have a poor nutritional balance.
Question up front here.
This is for Mr. Devadas. I was just curious, it's my understanding that GMOs aren't currently regulated by the USDA. There's a voluntary registry for grains, but I'm guessing your testing structure is something akin to FDA clinical studies where you'd start, with testing the individual corn, work your way up to animals, do some human testing, and then maybe clear. I just wanted to know if you would clarify a little bit how you do testing for GMOs before you release them to the public, and then also what you would think about, do you think it would be beneficial for innovation to increase regulation and kind of have a Hatch-Waxman sort of situation where agricultural patents could get that time back for more regulated testing if it were to become more of a structured thing?
Man, I'll bet you thought you were just going to skate by with those first questions. I'll go into everybody else, huh?
Okay, the first question. Biotech or GM crops are regulated by USDA and to some extent by the EPA and FDA, depending on what categories they fall in. So I think leading scientists have come out, right? Even there is a recent article a couple of days back that said biotech crops are one of the most tested, highly regulated crops ever to be products to be released for public consumption. So yeah, there is a number of testing requirements by the USDA, FDA, and EPA, and I think at least the water is close enough for me. So yeah, number of tests go through before we release a product. So the scientific evidence is clearly out there in terms of safety, allergenicity, and testing. So no question about that. So in terms of whether we need more regulation, that's I think it's more like the water ID fraud law. No, there's no necessity now in terms of there's lack of regulation for safety and efficacy. But if there is a need, then the regulatory bodies are going to determine that. And going to the Hatch-Waxman, You're right, we don't. The crop biotech industry does not have a Hatch-Waxman type provision. It's being discussed, but it's not yet on a bill or anything like that. But it is something that the industry is considering.
But is that something that you think would increase or hamper innovation?
It would definitely help innovate, I think. That's, again, my personal opinion, because the gene patents that we file early on, and by the time a product hits the market, it's about 10 to 15 years, and 7 of those is going to be the regulatory testing and trials. So at least 3/4 of the patent life is gone by the time a product hits the market. So yeah, having a Hatch-Waxman type patent term would definitely help innovation.
Great.
This is for, I guess, Nick and Kevin. Nick said that it could take 3 years for you to develop a dish, and that if someone comes out with it at basically the same time, you scrap it. And then you also said that if you don't bother with NDAs because they're unenforceable, but you use design patents because they are enforceable. Just hypothetically, if you could protect that 3-year development period and prevent the Spain or Madrid restaurant from coming out with that dish, would you, or would you just say that's part of this industry?
Yeah, the latter. I understand that it doesn't seem like a rational argument, as doing the other, you're like shaking your head at me going, this guy's nuts. It's interesting because I've been in both worlds. I've done software development. I've done, sort of in trading, you never want to actually tell anybody anything. You don't actually patent anything. You don't talk to the press. You don't do anything. You just go with a secrecy kind of, theory instead. To a certain extent, that's what we do while we're developing something. In that case that you mentioned, we came at both things independently. And the only reason we didn't release it was simply because we didn't want to look like the guy. We hadn't actually stolen anything. We actually developed it on our own. It was just that we didn't want it to even be a question of us not innovating. Now, we could have done that and just explained it or not cared. It's just not what we build our brand around. So that's essentially a marketing decision, not an IP decision.
We're here. Yep.
Oh, excellent. So this is partially for Mr. Devadas, but also partially for the whole panel. We've been hearing a lot about a culture where norms and society has been the most effective means of enforcement over more traditional IP techniques. Do you see a point or a value in trying to, this would be really hard, but trying to encourage a similar culture of appreciation for other companies' work, I guess, as a means of enforcement to perhaps complement a current IP strategy, perhaps cut down on litigation?
I think that's what we call as licensing. So, I think it's an extremely competitive environment, and I think the businesses need to make money and survive. And IP, in terms of attribution, is what we call as quote-unquote licensing. I think licensing is part of an IP strategy, and I think you have seen, if you followed the litigation issues in the seed industry, there are a number of them, and so it's a highly litigious, competitive marketplace. So I think we, as a company, it's there to make money for the shareholders, and what's the best approach, that's the one that's going to dictate what route we take. And not all cases go to court, so.
We've got one final question, and because I'm holding the microphone, I'm going to get to ask it. But after the question, Shane has a few comments, just so everyone doesn't run immediately to the food and drink that's awaiting them. Kevin, I believe there's some anecdote about the naming of the girl and the goat, and I wondered if you would be able to tell us this anecdote.
Sure, it's a soap opera. When we first decided to open up what was going to be Girl and the Goat, the name of it was going to be The Drunken Goat. Izard, it means Pyrenees mountain goat. So when she was actually on the show Top Chef, someone said, "What are you going to do after this?" And she said, "I'm going to open up a restaurant. It's going to be the something goat. So name some stuff to describe me." And somebody jokingly said drunk, and so it was the Drunken Goat. So when we first contacted Brett Tolpin, our IP attorney, he said, "It looks pretty good. There is someone who has the trademark on retail cheese for Drunken Goat cheese, but not restaurants. You should be okay." And because there was a lot of pre-press for the restaurant, we immediately received a cease and desist letter from the Drunken Goat Cheese Company. She was a very tough woman out of New York City. And because they were licensing it in all the Whole Foods stores, she made a argument that there was going to be some confusion in the marketplace. And she made it very clear that she was going to be litigious and push it all the way. And we said, we're doing our website right now, we're doing our logos, we're doing everything. Do we really want to spend all this money on the name of the Drunken Goat and then maybe have to change it? So we said, all right, we'll change it. So we said, all right, we're going to call it the Wandering Goat, because we were doing these Wandering Goat dinners. And once again, Mr. Tolpin, in his ultimate wisdom, said, "There is a Wandering Goat coffee company in Eugene, Oregon. You might want to talk to them." So we decided to be proactive this time and talk to these very friendly fellows, and they told us that they were indeed going to open up a Wandering Goat coffee shop in Chicago, Illinois, and please think again. So then we decided, all right, let's think of a name no one has. We said, all right, the name is going to be The Girl and the Goat. It is a crazy name. No one could possibly contact us about this. It took about 2 weeks after saying what the name was, and we received a email from the woman who owns The Girl and the Fig in Sonoma. And this time we said, you know what, fuck this.
A goat is not a fig.
It is not a fig. And so my partner and I got on the phone with her, and she says to us, she says, we're like, listen, the girl and the goat, the girl and the fig is not even close. And she goes, but I'm the girl. And so I think that Rob said something like, well, what if we named it The Girl in the Rubik's Cube? Would you still be suing us? And she said yes. And we said, no, we don't think so. So we said, you come at us with whatever you got. And she never ended up coming at us. And so we ended up with The Girl and the Goat. But that was my entry into IP law. So.
Excellent. All right, so a couple comments before we finish tonight. Once again, we would like to thank our top sponsor, Core Search. So if you are around their table, please stop in, say hi, and ask them what they're all about. Also, I'm asked, I don't even know why we have to say this, but no alcohol outside, so don't take alcohol outside. And
keep it in the tabled area. That's what I've been told.
Okay.
I've been chewed out twice by the security guard in the past 3 weeks for drinking in the law school, and I don't want to make it 3 times. So.
Only one of those was in class, right?
So with that, would you join me in thanking our panel?